In the dusty corners of a forgotten frontier town, a rowdy gang of outlaws rules with unchecked arrogance, terrorizing anyone who crosses their path. One night, their drunken bravado turns toward a seemingly timid saloon girl, mocking her and threatening violence. But this girl is no victim. Beneath her modest apron and quiet demeanor lies the soul of a legend, a retired bounty hunter who left her violent past behind. When the gang takes things too far, they awaken the fury of a woman who has taken down the West's most dangerous criminals. What follows is a tale of vengeance, justice, and the dismantling of a criminal empire, one outlaw at a time. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button for our YouTube channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming stories. Your support truly helps us share these hard-hitting stories with more people. The flicker of oil lamps cast a warm, hazy glow over the wooden walls of the Silver Spur Saloon. The sound of clinking glasses and drunken laughter filled the air, blending with the off-key twang of a piano played by an old man in the corner. It was another typical night in the small town of Red Bluff, a place barely hanging on to its identity amidst the encroachment of lawlessness. Lila Monroe wiped down the bar with practiced efficiency, her movements steady despite the chaos around her. Her long auburn hair was pinned beneath a modest bonnet, and her simple dress did little to reveal the wiry strength beneath. To the patrons, she was just another saloon girl, quiet, dutiful, unassuming. She preferred it that way. Lila had been working at the Silver Spur for nearly a year, hiding in plain sight. Few knew her true story, and even fewer dared to ask. The truth was that Lila wasn't just a saloon girl. She was a former bounty hunter, once infamous across the West for her skill and ruthlessness. She had retired after a particularly brutal job left her questioning the path she'd chosen. Red Bluff was meant to be her escape, a place to blend into the background and live a life free from bloodshed. But peace was hard to come by in Red Bluff. The town was under the thumb of a gang known as the Black Vultures, a band of outlaws who had swept in like a plague, robbing, extorting, and terrorizing the townsfolk. Their leader, Clyde Mercer, was as cruel as he was cunning, and his men were no better. They came to the Silver Spur often, their presence turning the atmosphere from lively to oppressive. Tonight was no different. The doors swung open with a bang, and a group of black vultures swaggered in, their boots heavy on the wooden floor. Lila didn't need to look up to know who they were. The smell of sweat, whiskey, and gunpowder was enough. "Lila," one of them shouted, his voice slurred. It was Roy Granger, a wiry man with a scar across his cheek. He staggered to the bar, slamming his hand down. "Get us some whiskey, darlin'. And make it quick." Lila didn't flinch. She poured their drinks with practiced calm, placing the glasses on the bar. "Here you go," she said, her voice steady but cool. Roy leered at her, his bloodshot eyes scanning her face. "You're a quiet one, ain't ya? Bet there's more fire in ya than you let on." His words were met with laughter from his companions. Lila ignored him, moving to wipe down the far end of the bar. But Roy wasn't done. He grabbed her wrist as she passed, his grip rough and unrelenting. "I'm talking to you, girl." Lila's eyes darted to his hand, her body going rigid. Memories of another life surged to the surface, gunfights, blood, the weight of a bounty poster in her hand. She pushed them down, forcing herself to remain calm. "Let go," she said evenly, her voice carrying a warning edge. The saloon grew quieter as heads turned toward the commotion. The other patrons knew better than to intervene when the black vultures were involved. Roy grinned, leaning closer. "Or what? You gonna cry for help? Maybe beg? Go ahead. I like it when they fight back." Lila's jaw tightened, but she didn't move. She was calculating, her mind racing through the options. A fight here would blow her cover, but letting him continue was unthinkable. Just as Roy's grip tightened, a deep voice interrupted. "Let the lady go." All heads turned to the speaker, a grizzled rancher at a corner table. His hand rested on the butt of his revolver, his eyes hard as stone. Roy hesitated, weighing his options. Finally, with a sneer, he released Lila's wrist. "You're lucky," he muttered, pointing a finger at her. "But don't think this is over." The tension lingered as the gang took their drinks and slouched at a nearby table. Lila rubbed her wrist, her mind buzzing. She glanced at the rancher, who tipped his hat in a silent acknowledgement. As the night wore on, the black vultures became rowdier, their taunts growing louder. Lila remained composed, but inside, something was shifting. The life she had left behind, the strength, the fire, the willingness to fight back, was stirring awake. The gang thought they had put her in her place. What they didn't realize was that they had lit the fuse of something far more dangerous. Lila Monroe wasn't just a saloon girl, and soon, they would find out exactly what that meant. The Silver Spur Saloon simmered with tension as the night dragged on. The black vultures dominated the room, their boisterous laughter and crude remarks filling the air. Lila moved behind the bar with her usual quiet efficiency, but inside, she was a storm. The ache in her wrist from Roy's grip was a small thing compared to the rage bubbling beneath her composed exterior. She stole a glance at the gang's table. Roy was at the center, boasting loudly about his latest misdeeds. His companions, 5 men as brutish and unkempt as he was, roared with laughter at every crude punchline. Their presence was a poison, seeping into the saloon and draining it of its usual energy. Lila's mind raced. She had spent a year carefully avoiding confrontation, blending into the background, and letting her former life as a bounty hunter fade into memory. But tonight had shaken something loose. She had worked too hard to build a peaceful life in Red Bluff, and she wasn't about to let the black vultures take it from her. At the same time, she knew she couldn't act recklessly. The gang was dangerous, and Clyde Mercer, their leader, was even more so. Taking them on would mean risking everything, not just her life, but the lives of the townsfolk she had come to care about. She couldn't afford to be impulsive. She needed a plan. As the night wore on, the gang's drunkenness turned meaner. They began harassing other patrons, knocking over chairs, and throwing dice at the piano player, who flinched with every clatter. Lila's jaw clenched, her grip tightening on the rag in her hand. "You should leave," came a low voice beside her. Lila turned to see the rancher from earlier. He stood at the bar, his hat pulled low over his face, but his eyes were sharp and knowing. "I can handle myself," Lila replied, her voice steady. "I don't doubt it," the rancher said. "But those men are trouble. They won't stop until someone puts them down." Lila didn't respond, but his words struck a chord. She knew he was right. The black vultures had been terrorizing Red Bluff for months, and the townsfolk had endured it out of fear. But fear had never been her way. Roy's voice cut through the saloon, drawing her attention. "Hey, Lila," he shouted, slamming his mug on the table. "Come over here. We got a toast for ya." The other outlaws laughed, their eyes gleaming with malice. Lila's stomach turned, but she forced her expression to remain neutral. She stepped out from behind the bar and approached their table, her movements measured and deliberate. "What do you want?" she asked, keeping her voice even. Roy grinned, his scar twisting grotesquely. "We're celebratin'. To all the pretty girls who know their place." The table erupted in laughter, but Lila's eyes stayed locked on Roy's. Something in her gaze made his grin falter, just for a second. She leaned closer, her voice low and cold. "You might want to enjoy your drink, Roy. It could be your last." The laughter died, replaced by a tense silence. Roy's eyes narrowed, his bravado flickering like a candle in a strong wind. He leaned back in his chair, muttering something under his breath, and Lila turned on her heel, walking away without a backward glance. Behind the bar, her hands trembled slightly as she wiped a glass clean. She wasn't afraid of Roy or his gang. But she knew the stakes had just risen. Her words had been a warning, but they could also be seen as a challenge, and the black vultures weren't known for backing down. As the night wound down, the gang finally stumbled out of the saloon, their rowdy laughter fading into the night. Lila watched them go, her eyes cold and calculating. The rancher approached her again, his expression unreadable. "You just poked the bear," he said. "They've been poking me for months," Lila replied. "It's time someone poked back." The rancher studied her for a long moment before nodding. "If you need help, you know where to find me." Lila offered a faint smile. "Thanks, but I've got this." The rancher tipped his hat and left, leaving Lila alone in the quiet saloon. She leaned against the bar, her mind already working through the possibilities. If the black vultures wanted a fight, she would give them one, but on her terms, not theirs. She climbed the narrow staircase to her small room above the saloon, closing the door behind her. In the corner, beneath a loose floorboard, lay a battered leather case. She hesitated for a moment before prying it open, revealing the tools of her old trade, a pair of well-worn revolvers, a knife, and a coil of rope. Lila ran her fingers over the weapons, the weight of her past pressing down on her. She had walked away from this life, but now it seemed it had found her again. With a deep breath, she began to prepare. If the black vultures wanted to see fire, they were about to get burned. The sun was barely cresting the horizon when Lila rose, her resolve solidified by a restless night. Her small room above the saloon was quiet, save for the soft creak of the wooden floorboards as she moved. The battered leather case sat open on the bed, its contents laid out neatly, her revolvers, knife, a few lengths of rope, and a small map of the surrounding area. Lila strapped the weapons to her body with the ease of long-practiced skill. The revolvers sat snug in their holsters on her hips, the knife sheathed at her thigh. She had once sworn to leave these tools behind, but the black vultures had made that impossible. They had forced her hand. She descended the stairs into the empty saloon, the usual clamor of the night replaced by an eerie stillness. The bartender, an older man named Jasper, was wiping down the counter when he saw her. "You're up early," Jasper remarked, his eyes narrowing as he noticed her gear. "You're not planning to do something foolish, are you?" Lila met his gaze, her expression unyielding. "I'm planning to do something necessary." Jasper sighed, leaning heavily on the bar. "Lila, you don't owe this town anything. If you go after them, you'll stir up a hornet's nest." "They already stirred it," Lila replied firmly. "I'm just making sure it stings them back." Jasper studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Just, be careful, all right? Red Bluff can't afford to lose you." Lila offered a faint smile. "Don't worry about me, Jasper. I've faced worse." She stepped out into the crisp morning air, the quiet streets of Red Bluff stretching before her. The town was still waking up, the scent of fresh bread wafting from the bakery, the distant sound of a blacksmith hammering iron. Lila's boots clicked softly against the dirt road as she made her way toward the livery. The rancher from the previous night was there, saddling his horse. He looked up as she approached, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "You're riding out early," he said, his tone cautious. "I've got business to handle," Lila replied, her voice steady. The rancher hesitated, then nodded toward her gear. "You're going after them, aren't you?" Lila didn't answer directly. "They've had their run of this town long enough." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I don't know your story, but I've seen that look before. Just be sure you know what you're getting into. Mercer's not just some thug. He's got connections, resources. If you take a swing at him, you'd better not miss." "I don't plan to," Lila said, meeting his gaze. The rancher studied her for a moment, then extended a hand. "Name's Sam. If you need a backup, you know where to find me." Lila shook his hand, appreciating the offer, but knowing this was something she had to handle herself. "Thanks, Sam. I'll keep it in mind." She saddled her own horse, a sturdy mare named Willow, and set off toward the outskirts of town. The black vultures had a camp a few miles east, nestled in a rocky canyon that offered natural protection. It was a bold move to set up so close to Red Bluff, but it also made them predictable. Lila's heart pounded as she rode, a mixture of anticipation and the familiar rush of danger. This wasn't just about revenge or justice, it was about reclaiming control. The black vultures had terrorized her, the townsfolk, and anyone who dared to stand in their way. Today, that ended. She reached the edge of the canyon and dismounted, tying Willow to a sturdy tree. The camp was just ahead, hidden from view by a ridge. Lila crept forward, her footsteps silent on the rocky ground. When she reached the top of the ridge, she crouched low, peering down at the camp below. The black vultures were scattered, their tents and makeshift structures sprawled across the canyon floor. A few men were gathered around a fire, laughing and drinking, despite the early hour. Others were tending to horses or sharpening weapons. Lila's eyes narrowed as she spotted Roy Granger near the center of the camp, his scarred face unmistakable. Her grip tightened on her revolvers. She had no intention of charging in guns blazing, she needed to be smart, methodical. Taking down the black vultures wasn't just about brute force, it was about dismantling their power, piece by piece. Lila studied the camp, memorizing its layout and noting potential weaknesses. The horses were tethered near a cluster of tents, their restless movements a stark contrast to the outlaws' drunken revelry. The fire pit was central, drawing most of the attention. If she could create a distraction there, she could split their focus. But her true target wasn't the camp, it was their leader, Clyde Mercer. He wasn't in sight, which meant he was likely holed up in the largest tent at the back of the camp. Taking him down would send a clear message: the black vultures were finished. Lila retreated from the ridge and began to plan. She would wait until nightfall, when the shadows were deepest and the outlaws were at their most vulnerable. Until then, she prepared, her mind sharp and focused. The black vultures thought they owned Red Bluff. Tonight, they would learn what happened when they underestimated Lila Monroe. The sun dipped low over the canyon, casting long shadows that crept across the rocky terrain. Lila remained hidden on the ridge, her body pressed against the cool stone as she observed the black vultures camp below. The outlaws moved about with a mix of drunken swagger and lazy confidence, their guard lowered in the complacency of their dominance. Lila had spent the day carefully planning her approach. The gang was too large to confront directly, but she didn't need to take them all at once. She was going to dismantle them piece by piece, starting with their leader, Clyde Mercer. She had seen him briefly earlier in the afternoon, emerging from the largest tent to bark orders at his men. He was a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a commanding presence, his voice carrying easily across the camp. His reputation as a cunning and ruthless leader was well earned, and Lila knew that taking him out would send a powerful message. As darkness fell, the camp grew quieter, the outlaws settling into their usual routines. Some gathered around the fire, their laughter echoing in the canyon, while others disappeared into their tents, leaving only a few to patrol the perimeter. Lila tightened her leather gloves, her mind laser-focused on the task ahead. This wasn't her first infiltration, but it was the first in a long time. Her muscles ached with the memory of past hunts, but her instincts remained sharp. She moved down the ridge with practiced stealth, her boots finding solid footing on the rocky slope. The night cloaked her in shadows as she slipped closer to the camp, her breath steady and controlled. The scent of wood smoke and unwashed bodies grew stronger, mingling with the faint metallic tang of gun oil. Her first target was the patrol. 2 men circled the camp at a leisurely pace, their rifles slung carelessly over their shoulders. They walked too close together, their conversation a distraction that left their flanks exposed. Lila waited until they passed her hiding spot, then struck. She moved like a ghost, her blade flashing in the moonlight as she pressed it to the throat of the rear man. His companion turned too late, his eyes widening in alarm. "Don't," Lila hissed, her voice low and commanding. "Drop the rifle." The man hesitated, his hand twitching toward his weapon. Lila pressed the blade harder against his partner's skin, a thin line of blood beating where the steel bit into flesh. "I said drop it." With a curse, the man let the rifle fall to the ground, the clatter muffled by the soft earth. Lila disarmed the second man in a fluid motion, her knife never leaving its mark. "Hands behind your heads. Both of you," she ordered. They obeyed, their bravado crumbling under her icy gaze. Lila tied their hands with rope she had brought, securing them to a nearby tree. "If you make a sound," she warned, "you won't live to regret it." Satisfied they were neutralized, she slipped deeper into the camp. Her next target was the horse pen. Without their mounts, the black vultures would be stranded, their mobility crippled. She reached the tethered horses, their ears flicking nervously at her approach. "Easy," Lila whispered, her voice soothing as she worked quickly. She cut the reins, releasing the animals one by one. The horses stamped and snorted, sensing the opportunity for freedom. With a sharp whistle, Lila sent them galloping into the night, their hoofs thundering like a distant storm. The noise drew shouts from the camp. Outlaws scrambled from their tents, their confusion and anger palpable. Lila used the chaos to her advantage, slipping through the shadows toward Mercer's tent. She paused outside, her heart hammering in her chest. This was it, the moment she had been building toward. Taking out Mercer wouldn't just disrupt the gang, it would shatter their morale. She drew her revolver, the familiar weight a comfort in her hand, and stepped inside. The interior of the tent was dimly lit by a single lantern. Clyde Mercer sat at a wooden table, his back to her as he pored over a map. He didn't look up as she entered, his voice calm but edged with irritation. "What the hell's going on out there?" Lila cocked the revolver, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. "That would be me." Mercer froze, his shoulders tensing as he slowly turned to face her. His eyes narrowed as he took her in, recognition dawning. "You're the saloon girl," he said, a mixture of disbelief and amusement in his tone. Lila's expression didn't waver. "Not exactly." Mercer's gaze flicked to her revolver, then back to her face. "You've got guts. I'll give you that. But pointing a gun at me is the last mistake you'll ever make." Lila stepped closer, her voice cold and steady. "You and your men have been terrorizing Red Bluff for months. That ends tonight." Mercer chuckled darkly, leaning back in his chair. "You think you can take us all out? Alone? You've got no idea what you're dealing with, sweetheart." "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," Lila replied. "The question is, do you?" Before Mercer could respond, the sound of a gunshot echoed outside, followed by more shouting. The camp was in full chaos now, the outlaws scrambling to regain control. Lila kept her revolver trained on Mercer, her finger steady on the trigger. "You've already lost," she said. "But you're too arrogant to see it." Mercer's smirk faltered, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. For the first time, he realized that this wasn't just a saloon girl standing before him. This was a hunter, and he was her prey. Clyde Mercer's smirk dissolved as the weight of the situation settled over him. The chaos outside his tent had reached a fever pitch, shouts of confusion, the clatter of hooves fading into the night, and the sharp crack of gunfire as his outlaws scrambled to respond to the disruption. But here, in the dim confines of his tent, he was face to face with a calm, lethal presence that unsettled even him. Lila Monroe stood firm, her revolver unwavering. Her voice was low and steady, carrying the kind of confidence that only came from someone who had stared death in the face and survived. "The black vultures have been living on borrowed time, Mercer. Tonight, the clock runs out." Mercer chuckled, though it lacked his usual bravado. "You think one woman can take down my whole crew? You've got guts, I'll give you that. But you're way out of your league." Lila took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. "Funny thing about leagues, I've spent my life hunting men who thought they were untouchable. Most of them are dead now." Mercer's jaw tightened, and he leaned forward in his chair, his hands resting on the table. "You've got a good act, girl, but that badge doesn't mean a damn thing to me anymore." Lila's lips curved into a faint smile. "It's not the badge you should worry about. It's me." Before Mercer could respond, a commotion at the tent's entrance drew both their attention. One of his lieutenants burst inside, panting and wild-eyed. "Boss, it's bad. The horses are gone, patrols tied up, and..." He froze as he spotted Lila, his hand flying to his holstered gun. Lila fired before he could draw, the shot ringing out in the confined space. The man crumpled to the ground, clutching his leg and howling in pain. Mercer lunged toward the fallen man's weapon, but Lila was faster. She kicked the gun across the tent and stepped forward, pressing her boot against Mercer's chest to pin him in place. "Don't," she warned, her voice cold. The sound of the shot and the commotion had attracted attention. More outlaws approached the tent, their voices growing louder. Lila knew her time was running out. She needed to neutralize Mercer before his men stormed in. "Get up," she ordered, motioning for him to stand. Mercer hesitated, his eyes darting toward the tent flap. "You think you can just walk out of here with me?" Lila smirked. "I don't need to walk out. I just need to finish what I started." Mercer's eyes widened slightly as he realized she wasn't bluffing. He rose slowly, his hands raised. "You don't want to do this, girl. Killing me won't solve your problems." "No," Lila agreed, her revolver trained on him. "But it'll solve Red Bluff's." Before she could act, the tent flap flew open, and 2 more outlaws barged in, their guns drawn. Lila moved on instinct, diving to the side as bullets ripped through the air. She rolled to her feet, firing twice. One man dropped instantly, and the other stumbled back, clutching his shoulder. Mercer seized the distraction, lunging toward the table where his knife was buried in the wood. He yanked it free and turned toward Lila, his face twisted in fury. She sidestepped his wild swing, her movements precise and controlled. The fight was close and brutal. Mercer was strong, his strikes powerful, but Lila was faster. She ducked under a swing and drove her elbow into his ribs, forcing him back. He slashed again, but she caught his wrist and twisted, disarming him with a sharp motion. Mercer stumbled, and Lila pressed the barrel of her revolver against his temple. "This is over," she said, her voice cold and final. The tension hung heavy in the air as Mercer stared at her, his chest heaving. "You don't have the guts," he spat. Lila's eyes narrowed. "You don't know me." Before she could pull the trigger, the sound of approaching footsteps and shouting forced her to reassess. Mercer's reinforcements were closing in, and she was out of time. She delivered a sharp blow to his temple with the butt of her revolver, dropping him unconscious to the ground. Lila grabbed a length of rope from the corner of the tent and bound Mercer's hands tightly. She hoisted him over her shoulder, her muscles straining but steady. The outlaws wouldn't expect her to take their leader alive, and she planned to use that to her advantage. As she stepped out of the tent, the camp was chaos. Fires burned in scattered pits, casting flickering shadows across the rocky terrain. Outlaws shouted orders and fired blindly into the darkness, their disarray playing perfectly into her plan. Using the shadows as cover, Lila moved toward the edge of the camp, her every step measured and silent. Mercer's weight slowed her, but adrenaline and determination kept her moving. She reached the ridge where she had tied Willow, the mare's ears flicking nervously as Lila approached. She secured Mercer to the saddle and swung up behind him, her revolver ready as she scanned the camp. A few outlaws had spotted her, their shouts rising in alarm. But before they could act, she urged Willow into a gallop, the mare surging forward with powerful strides. Bullets whizzed past as Lila and Mercer disappeared into the night, the canyon walls echoing with the shouts of frustrated outlaws. The Black Vultures had lost their leader, and the first cracks in their empire were beginning to show. As the cool night air rushed past her, Lila's mind was clear. This was only the beginning. Mercer's capture was the first step in dismantling the Black Vultures, and she wasn't stopping until the entire gang was brought to its knees. The night stretched out before Lila as she rode hard away from the canyon, her captive slumped across Willow's saddle. Clyde Mercer was heavy and unconscious, his head lolling with each jolt of the horse's stride. The Black Vulture's shouts faded into the distance, but Lila knew it wouldn't be long before they regrouped and came after her. She glanced over her shoulder, her sharp eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of pursuit. The landscape was quiet, save for the rhythmic sound of Willow's hooves against the dirt. For now, she was alone, but she couldn't afford to slow down. The moon cast a pale light over the rugged terrain, guiding her toward a rocky outcrop she had scouted earlier. It was an ideal spot to regroup and assess her next move, a natural fortress with a single narrow entrance and high vantage points. When she reached the outcrop, Lila dismounted and dragged Mercer from the saddle. He groaned as she propped him against a rock, his hands still bound tightly. She checked the ropes to ensure they held, then gave him a sharp slap to rouse him. Mercer's eyes fluttered open, and he blinked groggily. When he realized where he was, and who was standing over him, his expression darkened. "You're a damn fool, girl," he growled. "You think you've won? My men will find you, and when they do, they'll make you wish you'd never crossed us." Lila crouched in front of him, her revolver resting casually on her knee. Her voice was calm, but edged with steel. "Your men are chasing shadows right now. By the time they figure out where I've gone, it'll be too late." Mercer sneered, his bravado returning. "You think dragging me out here will change anything? The black vultures are bigger than me, bigger than any one man. You can't stop us." Lila leaned closer, her gaze cold and unwavering. "I'm not just after you, Mercer. I'm after everything you've built. And by the time I'm done, the black vultures won't exist." Mercer's confidence flickered, replaced by a flash of uncertainty. Lila stood, holstering her revolver as she turned away. "Get comfortable," she said over her shoulder. "You're going to be here for a while." She climbed a nearby rock, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The outcrop gave her a clear view of the surrounding terrain, and the cool night air sharpened her senses. She had bought herself some time, but she knew it was limited. As the hours passed, Lila worked quickly, fortifying the outcrop with natural barriers and setting traps to slow any approaching pursuers. She moved with purpose, her mind clear and focused. This wasn't just about surviving the night, it was about using Mercer to dismantle the black vultures from the inside out. By the time dawn broke, the sky streaked with shades of orange and pink, Lila had a plan. She returned to Mercer, who had fallen into a restless doze, and kicked the dirt near his feet to rouse him. "Wake up," she ordered. "We need to talk." Mercer glared at her, his jaw clenched. "I don't have anything to say to you." Lila smirked, her tone dripping with calculated menace. "Oh, I think you do. See, I know how men like you operate. You keep secrets, locations of stashes, contacts, safe houses. You think that makes you powerful." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "But all it does is make you a liability. And right now, you've got one chance to make yourself useful." Mercer's defiance wavered, but he covered it with a sneer. "You're bluffing. You won't kill me. You need me." Lila's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I don't need you alive." She drew her knife, the blade gleaming in the early light, and pressed it against his throat. "Talk, Mercer. Or I'll leave you for your men to find, assuming they get here before the vultures do." Mercer swallowed hard, his bravado slipping. "You wouldn't." "Try me," Lila said, her voice ice cold. The tension hung thick in the air as Mercer weighed his options. Finally, he let out a bitter laugh. "Fine. You want information? I'll give you something. But it's going to cost you." Lila stepped back, her knife still in hand. "You're not in a position to make demands." Mercer gritted his teeth. "You think you're the only one who wants to see the black vultures gone? There's someone out there with a bigger grudge than you. A rival gang leader, goes by the name Hawthorne. He's been itching to take us down, but he doesn't have the guts." Lila frowned, her mind racing. "And you think he'll help me?" Mercer shrugged, a sly grin tugging at his lips. "He might. Or he might just kill you on sight. Either way, it'll be entertaining." Lila considered his words carefully. Aligning with a rival gang was a risk, but if it meant cutting deeper into the Black Vulture's network, it was a risk worth taking. She sheathed her knife and turned away. "Where can I find him?" she asked. Mercer hesitated, then muttered, "North of Red Bluff. There's an old mining town, abandoned, mostly. He uses it as his base." Lila nodded, filing the information away. Good. Now sit tight, Mercer. This is just the beginning. As she prepared to move, her resolve hardened. The black vultures thought they were untouchable, but she was going to prove them wrong, one calculated step at a time. The first rays of sunlight cast a warm glow over the rocky outcrop as Lila tightened the ropes binding Clyde Mercer to a sturdy tree. He winced as the cords bit into his wrists, his defiance now tempered with unease. Lila wasn't taking any chances. Mercer was a cunning man, and she couldn't afford to let her guard down. Comfortable? She asked, her voice laced with sarcasm. Mercer sneered, but the flicker of nervousness in his eyes betrayed him. You think you've got this all figured out, don't you? Dragging me out here, tying me up like some dog. Lila crouched in front of him, her expression calm but deadly. You're right where you belong, Mercer. And if you're lucky, you'll live long enough to see the black vultures crumble. His face twisted into a scowl, but he said nothing. Lila turned away, grabbing her pack and slinging it over her shoulder. She had a long ride ahead of her if she was going to find Hawthorne, the rival gang leader Mercer had mentioned. It wasn't an ideal lead, but it was her best shot at gaining an ally, or at least sowing more chaos within the Black Vulture's network. Lila climbed onto Willow's saddle, giving Mercer one last glance. Don't go anywhere, she said with a smirk. I'll be back. Mercer growled something unintelligible as she rode off, his voice fading into the morning breeze. The trail ahead was rough and winding, leading north toward the abandoned mining town Mercer had described. The town had once been a hub of activity, but years of dwindling resources had left it a ghostly shell, the perfect hideout for someone like Hawthorne. As she rode, Lila's thoughts churned. Hawthorne's involvement was a gamble. He could turn out to be a dangerous wild card, or he could provide the leverage she needed to take down the black vultures. Either way, she was prepared for whatever awaited her. The journey took most of the day, the landscape shifting from rocky canyons to sprawling plains dotted with sparse vegetation. By late afternoon, the mining town came into view, its silhouette stark against the horizon. Crumbling buildings and rusted mining equipment littered the area, and the wind carried a faint metallic tang. Lila dismounted, tying Willow to a post near the outskirts of town. She approached cautiously, her hand resting on the grip of her revolver. The air was eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that put her on edge. She moved through the deserted streets, her boots kicking up small clouds of dust. State your business, a voice called out, sharp and commanding. Lila froze, her eyes scanning the area. A man stepped out from behind a weathered building, his rifle trained on her. He was tall and wiry, his face partially obscured by a bandana. His eyes narrowed as he took in her appearance. Easy, Lila said, raising her hand slightly. I'm here to see Hawthorne. The man snorted, his rifle steady. And why would he want to see you? Because I've got information about the black vultures, she replied evenly. And I'm guessing he'd like to hear it. The man hesitated, studying her for a long moment. Finally, he lowered the rifle. Follow me. Lila did as instructed, her guard up as he led her through the town. More men emerged from the shadows, their eyes cold and calculating. They were well armed and organized, a clear contrast to the black vulture's chaotic brutality. The man led her to the largest building in town, a two-story structure that had likely served as a saloon in its prime. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the low murmur of voices. At a table in the center, sat Hawthorne. He was older than she expected, with graying hair and a weathered face, but his presence was commanding. He leaned back in his chair, a cigar dangling from his lips, and regarded her with sharp, assessing eyes. So, he said, his voice deep and gravelly. You're the one stirring up trouble with Mercer and his boys. Lila stepped forward, her posture confident. Mercer's not your biggest problem right now. I am. Hawthorne raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Bold claim. Care to explain? I'm taking the black vultures down, Lila said, her tone firm. Mercer's already in my custody. What I need now is intel, routes, caches, allies. You help me, and I'll make sure they're too busy dealing with me to bother with you." Hawthorne chuckled, tapping ash from his cigar. "And what's stopping me from turning you into Mercer's men? They'd pay a pretty penny for your head." Lila smirked, her hand resting on her revolver. "You could try. But something tells me you're smarter than that." The room tensed, the air crackling with unspoken challenges. Hawthorne studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But if you want my help, you'll have to prove you're worth the risk." "What do you have in mind?" Lila asked, her voice steady. "There's a Black Vulture stash a few miles from here," Hawthorne said. "Big shipment of guns and ammo. Take it out, and I'll know you're serious." Lila nodded, her resolve unshaken. "Done." Hawthorne leaned back, a sly grin spreading across his face. "Good. Let's see if you're as tough as you look." As Lila turned to leave, she felt the weight of the room's eyes on her. This was more than just a test, it was a step deeper into the treacherous web of the criminal world she was determined to dismantle. But she welcomed the challenge. The Black Vultures had started this fight, but Lila Monroe was going to finish it. The wind whipped through the dry plains as Lila rode away from the abandoned mining town, her mind razor-focused on the task ahead. Hawthorne's test was more than a challenge, it was an opportunity. If she could cripple the Black Vulture stash and prove her worth, she'd gain Hawthorne's resources and insight into the gang's operations. It was a dangerous gamble, but one she was prepared to take. The stash was located in a decrepit warehouse, nestled near an old railway line, just a few miles from the mining town. Hawthorne's directions were clear, and as Lila approached, the structure came into view. It was a hulking, weathered building surrounded by sparse trees and rocky outcroppings. The warehouse was well guarded, she could see sentries patrolling the perimeter, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders. Dismounting Willow a safe distance away, Lila tied the horse to a tree and began her approach on foot. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the terrain. She moved with practiced stealth, her boots silent on the dry earth as she crept closer. Her eyes scanned the guards, noting their patterns and the blind spots in their patrols. From her vantage point behind a cluster of boulders, Lila assessed the scene. There were at least a dozen guards, most of them clustered near the warehouse entrance. 2 more stood on a raised platform, likely serving as lookouts. A large wagon sat to the side of the building, its contents covered by a heavy canvas tarp. Her mind raced, formulating a plan. A direct assault was out of the question, she was outnumbered and outgunned. But the guards' relaxed demeanor worked to her advantage. They weren't expecting trouble, which made them vulnerable to distraction and deception. Lila slipped back into the shadows, circling around to the rear of the warehouse. She found a stack of crates and broken barrels near the loading dock, likely remnants of previous operations. Grabbing a handful of dry straw, she pulled out a match and struck it against the crate's rough surface. The flame caught quickly, spreading to the surrounding debris. Within moments, the area was ablaze, thick smoke curling into the air. Lila retreated to a nearby hiding spot, her revolver drawn as she watched the guards react. "Fire!" one of the sentries shouted, his voice cutting through the stillness. The guards near the entrance scrambled toward the loading dock, their shouts of alarm echoing across the plain. Even the lookouts descended from their platform, leaving their posts to assist. With the guards distracted, Lila moved swiftly. She darted toward the wagon, her movements silent and deliberate. Pulling back the tarp, she revealed a cache of rifles, ammunition, and explosives, enough firepower to equip a small army. She worked quickly, placing charges she had taken from her pack among the crates. The explosives were simple but effective, and she positioned them carefully to ensure maximum destruction. Once the charges were set, she retreated to a safe distance and lit the fuse. The explosion tore through the air like a thunderclap, the shockwave rattling the ground beneath her feet. The warehouse shuddered as flames engulfed it, the ammunition inside igniting in a series of deafening bursts. Guards were thrown off their feet, their cries of panic drowned out by the chaos. Lila didn't wait to see the full extent of the destruction. She moved quickly, staying low as she made her way back to Willow. The horse snorted nervously at the noise, but Lila calmed her with a soft touch before mounting and urging her into a gallop. As she rode away, the fire raged behind her, the dark smoke rising into the evening sky like a beacon. The black vultures had just lost one of their key assets, and the ripple effect would weaken their entire operation. When Lila returned to Hawthorne's base, the atmosphere was tense. The men guarding the entrance watched her with wary eyes, but they stepped aside as she dismounted. Hawthorne was waiting for her in the saloon, his cigar smoldering between his fingers. His expression was unreadable as she approached. "Well?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. Lila didn't hesitate. "The stash is gone. The warehouse, the weapons, the ammo, all of it." Hawthorne raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharp. "You're sure?" "You'll see the smoke for miles," Lila replied, her voice steady. "If the vultures aren't already scrambling, they will be soon." Hawthorne studied her for a moment, then nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Impressive. Most people wouldn't have made it out of there alive." "I'm not most people," Lila said coolly. "No, you're not," Hawthorne agreed. He gestured to one of his men, who stepped forward with a rolled map. Hawthorne unrolled it on the table, revealing a network of routes and locations marked in ink. "These are the Black Vulture's supply lines," he explained. "They're bleeding now, but if you really want to take them down, you'll have to cut off their lifeblood. Hit these spots, and they'll crumble." Lila leaned over the map, her eyes scanning the intricate web of lines and markers. Each location represented a vital piece of the vulture's operation: safe houses, supply depots, and key meeting points. Taking them out would require precision and strategy, but it was exactly the kind of challenge she thrived on. "Consider it done," she said, straightening. Hawthorne chuckled, his admiration evident. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. Just make sure you don't get yourself killed." Lila smirked. "I don't plan to." As she left the saloon, the weight of the next step settled over her. The black vultures were wounded, but they weren't finished. Not yet. Lila was determined to see this through, to dismantle their empire piece by piece. And she wouldn't stop until every last one of them paid for what they had done. The sun had set by the time Lila mounted Willow again, the map Hawthorne had given her secured in her pocket. The next step was clear: she had to hit the vulture's supply lines, one by one, until their entire operation unraveled. Every depot, every safe house, every hidden stash of weapons would be gone. It was a methodical approach, but it was the only way to make sure the black vultures couldn't regroup. The night was crisp, the air biting against her skin as she rode out under the cover of darkness. Willow's steady gallop was the only sound as the world around them seemed to hold its breath. Lila had a singular focus now, the plan etched clearly in her mind. The first target was a supply depot to the north, hidden deep in a small valley, surrounded by thick trees. The black vultures used it to store stolen goods, everything from food and medicine to weapons. Hawthorne had been vague about the specifics of the depot, but Lila knew enough. The black vultures didn't take well to secrecy, and the more she studied their network, the clearer their vulnerabilities became. As she approached the area, Lila slowed Willow, scanning the terrain. The supply depot was nestled at the foot of a craggy ridge, its entrance guarded by 2 sentries. The moonlight barely cut through the trees, casting long, menacing shadows over the path. Lila dismounted, tethering Willow to a low-hanging branch. She crouched low, moving carefully through the underbrush. The sentries hadn't noticed her yet. One of them was pacing near a campfire, the glow from the flames flickering on his rough face. The other stood guard at the entrance, his back to her. Lila knew this was her moment. She had to be fast, precise. She reached for the knife at her belt, its cold steel a comfort in her hand. She crept closer to the sentry at the campfire, waiting for the right moment to strike. The man took a step forward, his attention distracted by something on the ground, giving Lila the opening she needed. In one fluid motion, she sprang from the shadows, her knife flashing in the moonlight as she silenced the man with a swift slash to his throat. He crumpled without a sound, his body hitting the ground softly. The second sentry heard the movement and spun around, but by then, Lila was already on him. She dropped low, tackling him to the ground before he could raise his rifle. She pressed her hand over his mouth, muffling his desperate gasps, and then, with one quick motion, twisted his neck. The man went limp in her grasp, his eyes wide with shock. Lila stood over the two bodies, her breathing steady as she surveyed the depot. The entrance was now unguarded. She moved forward, slipping through the small gap in the fence surrounding the building. Inside, crates were stacked high, covered with tarps. She could smell the musk of stolen goods and the faint, bitter scent of gunpowder. The task ahead was simple but necessary: destroy everything. She set to work, using her knife to slice open the crates, revealing bundles of ammunition, barrels of oil, and stacks of rations. She quickly planted small explosives near the stacks, making sure to place them strategically to cause maximum damage. She had set traps before, but this was different. This wasn't just about destruction, it was about taking the Black Vulture's resources and cutting off their ability to fight back. As she worked, her mind kept racing. How many more depots were there like this? How many more stashes of guns and supplies did they have scattered across the land? She had to be thorough. The Black Vultures couldn't be allowed to regroup. When she was satisfied, she set the final charge and withdrew, moving silently back through the trees. She reached Willow and mounted quickly, urging the mare into a swift gallop away from the depot. The fuse was short, and she had to get clear before it detonated. A few miles out, the night was shattered by the explosion. The force of it was immense, sending a shockwave through the air that rattled Lila's bones. She couldn't see the flames, but she knew the blast had lit up the sky. The Black Vultures would know their depot was gone by morning. Lila rode through the night, her mind focused on the next steps. She knew there were more locations to hit, more caches of stolen goods, and more lives to destroy. The Black Vultures were ruthless, but they weren't invincible. And Lila Monroe wasn't finished with them yet. She had struck a blow, and it would take them time to recover. But when they did, she'd be waiting. One target at a time. One victory after another. And when the smoke cleared, the Black Vultures would be no more. The days that followed were a blur of action and strategy. Lila hit another supply house, then another, each raid more successful than the last. Each explosion, each piece of destroyed equipment, brought the Black Vultures one step closer to collapse. Their men were confused, disoriented, and desperate, their power slipping away. But Lila knew better than to celebrate too soon. The Black Vultures might have been reeling, but Clyde Mercer was still out there, and Hawthorne was a wild card she couldn't fully trust. Every move she made had consequences, and the web she was weaving was growing ever more tangled. After each raid, Lila would return to the outskirts of Red Bluff to regroup and plan her next step. She couldn't afford to make any mistakes, not now. The final blow was coming, and she would be ready. Each time she mounted Willow and rode out under the moonlit sky, her mind was clear. The Vultures had taken too much, and now it was time to take everything from them. The game had changed. And Lila Monroe was no longer just a hunter. She was the storm that would bring the Black Vultures to their knees. Lila's pulse thrummed with the steady rhythm of purpose as she rode through the night. The Black Vultures had been reeling from her attacks, their stores of weapons and supplies rapidly depleting. They were cornered, and Lila could feel the shift in the air, their days were numbered. But she also knew that the most dangerous part of the game was still ahead, the final strike. Her eyes stayed focused on the trail ahead, the dim glow of the moonlight guiding her way. Willow's hooves pounded steadily on the dirt path, their sound almost rhythmic against the quiet backdrop of the desert. But Lila wasn't just riding for the thrill of it. Every mile closer to her next destination fueled the fire inside her, a fire stoked by years of regret, by lives lost and debts yet to be paid. The target this time was a safe house in the heart of the Black Vulture's operation. It was a place where they stashed their most valuable contraband, a warehouse hidden in plain sight behind a series of fences and watchful eyes. From the intel she'd gathered, this was the last major stash. If she took it out, the gang would be paralyzed. But it wouldn't be easy. This was their last bastion, the one place they'd defend with everything they had left. Lila knew she couldn't just walk in and blow the place to pieces. She needed to hit them hard, fast, and with precision. As she neared the location, her mind shifted into tactical mode. The air was cooler here, the desert surrounding the safe house a stark contrast to the chaos she knew would unfold. A few miles out, she dismounted and hid Willow in a thicket of bushes. The horse was a trusted companion, but in a fight like this, Lila didn't want anything drawing attention. She moved closer to the safe house, keeping to the shadows. The facility was bigger than she expected, with watchtowers on each corner and men patrolling the perimeter. She could see the guards from her hiding spot, moving with an air of arrogance, believing themselves untouchable. Not for long, she muttered under her breath. Lila crouched low, slipping toward the eastern side of the compound. The guards were lax here, distracted by the sounds of raucous laughter coming from the interior. Lila couldn't help but smirk. They were all too drunk on their own power to realize that their kingdom was crumbling around them. Her hands were steady as she pulled out the map she had been studying. The safe house was surrounded by 2 layers of fences. The outer perimeter was dotted with guard stations, while the inner fence housed the precious cargo. The entire setup was more fortified than she anticipated, but nothing she hadn't handled before. She spotted a break in the outer fence, a section where the guards' patrols had a gap in coverage. It was her opening. Lila's heart rate quickened as she moved swiftly through the shadows, using the terrain to her advantage. The guards didn't even see her coming. She reached the break in the fence, slipping through the opening like a shadow. Inside the second perimeter, the safe house loomed ahead, dimly lit and heavily guarded, but still vulnerable. Her first priority was taking out the outer guards, fast and silent. Lila had her revolver ready, the cool metal a familiar comfort in her hand. She crept up behind the first guard, a large man standing near the gate. Before he could turn around, Lila grabbed his shoulder and twisted it, delivering a sharp blow to his neck. He crumpled to the ground silently, his weapon falling from his grasp. She dragged him into the shadows, out of sight. The next guard was easier, distracted, talking to someone on a distant watchtower. Lila used the distraction to her advantage. She crept behind him, struck him hard enough to knock him out, and bound him swiftly with a rope. Now the path was clear. Lila approached the central building, taking a deep breath. She knew there would be more resistance inside, but she had prepared for this. She wasn't just here to steal weapons or burn supplies. She was here to make a statement. She reached the back door and cracked it open slightly, peering inside. 2 men sat at a table, cards scattered across it. Lila waited for the perfect moment, then slipped inside, her revolver drawn. "Don't move," she commanded, her voice deadly calm. The men froze, eyes wide with shock as they turned toward her. Lila's gun didn't waver. "Get up," she ordered. The men complied, their hands raised. "Where's the rest of your crew?" One of the men, a burly man with a scar running down his face, opened his mouth to speak, but stopped when Lila's gun shifted toward him. He swallowed hard. "Mercer, he's in charge of this stash. He's in the back." Lila's heart skipped. "Lead the way." The man hesitated but finally moved toward the back of the building, opening the door to reveal a large storage area. Boxes stacked high, crates of weapons, barrels of ammunition. And at the far end of the room, Mercer, sitting with his back turned, sipping from a flask. "You've got a lot of nerve showing up here, Monroe," Mercer said without turning around, his voice calm but laced with venom. "Did you really think you could take everything from me?" Lila stepped forward, her revolver raised. "You're finished, Mercer. This is where your empire dies." Mercer's smirk never faltered as he slowly turned around, his hand moving toward the desk drawer. "You don't know what you're messing with." You think you can just waltz in and take me out? You're just one woman. That's all I need, Lila shot back, her eyes cold and unwavering. Without warning, Mercer drew a hidden revolver from his desk, his hand a blur of movement. But Lila was faster. Her shot rang out first, striking Mercer's gun hand and forcing him to drop the weapon. You're done, she said, her voice a mixture of finality and satisfaction. As Mercer slumped back against the desk, Lila knew this was the moment everything changed. The Black Vultures had been brought to their knees. The loss of their leader would dismantle their remaining structure, leaving them scattered and weak. Lila didn't wait for Mercer to say another word. She turned and set the final charge, knowing that the safe house and the Black Vultures were about to meet their end. With one last glance at the wreckage she'd created, Lila left the building, disappearing into the night, knowing that the vultures had no more chance of survival. She had won. But the war was far from over. The explosion that followed was deafening. The shockwave rattled the earth beneath Lila's feet as the building she had just left erupted into flames, a fiery signal to the Black Vultures that they had lost everything. The sky was lit up by the orange glow of the fire, casting an eerie light over the landscape as smoke billowed into the air, visible for miles. Lila didn't wait to watch the destruction. She didn't need to. The Black Vultures had already been crippled with the loss of their stash, their leader, and their ability to act swiftly. She had dealt the final blow, now it was time to disappear before any survivors could regroup. She mounted Willow, her movements fluid and controlled as the mare snorted and shifted beneath her. The fire crackling behind her served as a reminder of the chaos she had unleashed. But Lila wasn't looking back. She had one last task to complete. As she rode through the darkened desert, the wind whipping her hair around her face, her thoughts were clear. The Black Vultures were finished, at least, the version of them that had plagued Red Bluff and terrorized the surrounding territories. But there was still the matter of Hawthorne. The rival gang leader who had given her the intel about the stash had played a dangerous game. She couldn't afford to leave him unchecked, especially since his gang had the potential to fill the void the Vultures had left behind. It wasn't over yet. The next morning, Lila rode into the town of Red Bluff, her posture rigid, her face expressionless. She had kept her distance from the town after her raids, preferring to work from the shadows. She had given them their moment of peace, but she knew that the locals couldn't remain unaware for long. When she reached the Silver Spur, she found it eerily quiet, the doors to the saloon swinging open lazily. Inside, the usual patrons sat, nursing their drinks, their faces tired but relieved. The town had breathed easier, but Lila knew better than anyone that there would always be another threat. Jasper was behind the bar, wiping down the counter as if nothing had happened. But when he saw Lila step through the door, he paused, his eyes narrowing. "You did it, didn't you?" he asked quietly. Lila nodded, her lips curving slightly, though it was more a grim acknowledgement than a smile. "It's done." Jasper's gaze flicked toward the door, the familiar, lingering unease returning. "What's next?" "I'm going after Hawthorne," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I can't leave him to pick up the pieces. The Black Vultures may be finished, but he's still a threat." Jasper sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. "You sure you're ready to take on another gang? After everything you've done?" Lila's gaze was unwavering. "I didn't get into this to walk away when the job's half done. I'll take him down, too." "You're something else, Lila Monroe," Jasper muttered, a look of both admiration and concern in his eyes. "Just make sure you don't lose yourself in the fight." "I won't," she replied simply, turning to leave. Before she could step outside, however, a voice called her name. It was familiar, but not one she had expected to hear. "I heard you were back." Lila turned to face the man approaching from the back of the room. He was older, his face lined with age and experience, but his presence still carried the weight of authority. "Sam, the rancher from the night of the Black Vultures raid." "You're still here?" she asked, surprised. "Still standing," Sam replied with a small grin. "And I've been thinking. If you're really going after Hawthorne, you might need a little help. Lila studied him for a moment. She knew he wasn't just some average rancher. Sam had been sharp enough to see through her cover the moment they met. He had the grit of someone who had survived his own battles and wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. "I can handle it," she said, though her voice lacked the usual certainty. Sam shook his head. "I don't doubt that you can. But Hawthorne isn't a man you take on alone. He's got too many men, too many resources. I've been around long enough to know when you need backup." Lila hesitated, the weight of his offer sinking in. She had grown accustomed to working alone, but the truth was that Hawthorne was a different animal. If she wanted to bring him down, she would need more than just her skills. She needed someone she could trust. "All right," she said finally. "But if we're doing this, we do it my way. No distractions." Sam's grin widened. "That's the only way I work." Later that day, Lila and Sam made their preparations. Sam's ranch was just outside Red Bluff, a modest spread with enough supplies to keep them stocked for a few days. Lila had no intention of leaving Hawthorne alive, but she knew better than to underestimate the man. The plan was simple: infiltrate his stronghold, destroy his resources, and take him out. She had already identified his base of operations, a small town to the east, not far from where the Black Vultures had been based. As night fell, Lila and Sam mounted their horses, the shadows of the desert stretching long before them. The town of Hawthorne's gang was barely a mile away, and they would need to move fast and strike hard. Lila's mind was clear as they rode in silence, the weight of the impending battle heavy but necessary. The sun had set, and the cool night air wrapped around them like a cloak. There was no turning back now. They had a job to do, and Lila Monroe was about to finish it, once and for all. The journey to Hawthorne's base was quick and uneventful, the desert passing beneath them as they rode in the quiet darkness. Lila's eyes stayed focused ahead, her hand resting lightly on the grip of her revolver, while Sam rode silently beside her. There was no need for words, both of them understood what was at stake. As they approached the outskirts of the town, Lila felt the weight of the coming conflict settle over her. Hawthorne's base was a collection of rundown buildings and makeshift fortifications, an isolated place where the rival gang had built a false sense of security. The area was quiet for now, the sounds of distant gunfire and shouts carried by the wind, a reminder of the chaos that always followed when outlaws like Hawthorne held sway over a place. They dismounted near the edge of the town, hiding their horses in the shadow of a crumbling structure. Lila's gaze swept across the area, her eyes scanning the dimly lit buildings and watching for any signs of movement. Sam was already crouched low, his posture tense and alert. "Same as always," Lila muttered, looking at the small group of guards patrolling near the gates of the town. The layout was familiar: 2 men near the front, a few more scattered at the edges, and a couple at the town's center. She knew that with the right timing, they could slip past undetected. Sam's voice broke the silence. "Think we can hit him without too much noise?" Lila nodded, her mind already working through the strategy. "We move fast. We hit the guards first, then take out their communication. Hawthorne won't expect us to strike so directly." Sam's hand rested on his rifle, his eyes narrowing as he followed her gaze. "You're sure about this?" Lila looked at him, her jaw set. "We don't have a choice. He's the last piece of the puzzle. Take him out, and his gang won't know what hit them." They moved in the shadows, their steps careful and quiet. Lila led the way, her instincts sharp as they approached the first guard near a stack of old crates. He was standing with his back to them, too distracted by his own thoughts to notice them creeping closer. Sam gestured to Lila, who nodded slightly. With a swift motion, Sam silenced the guard, knocking him unconscious without a sound. Lila quickly bound him and tucked him into a hidden alcove, her gaze sweeping the area. The town was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of life replaced by an unsettling stillness. But she knew better than to let her guard down. They continued through the darkened streets, methodical in their approach. Lila's heart rate quickened as they drew closer to the center of the town. She could feel the tension building. Each step, each second, was another chance for them to be discovered. But they were ghosts in the night, moving with purpose and precision. The next guard was near a crumbling wall, leaning lazily against it, his rifle at his side. Lila signaled to Sam, who moved first this time, closing the distance with quiet efficiency. He disarmed the man, then quickly knocked him out, laying him down without so much as a grunt. 2 down, and they hadn't been spotted. Lila felt a flicker of hope, but she didn't let it distract her. They were close now, so close to the heart of the operation. She needed to think about the next move, the next step that would take down Hawthorne once and for all. Sam caught up with her, his expression grim. 1 more guard ahead. I'll take him, you get to the center. We need to move fast before they realize something's wrong. Lila nodded, her eyes narrowing. She knew this was it, the final stretch. With the guards disabled, it was just a matter of reaching Hawthorne. She could feel the weight of everything that had led her here pressing down on her, but there was no room for hesitation. Sam crept ahead, his movements quick but silent. Lila moved in the opposite direction, heading toward the center of town. As she neared the main building, she could see the dim light flickering through the cracked windows, Hawthorne's base of operations. Her pulse quickened as she moved closer, the building now in her sights. She reached the entrance, pausing just outside the door. The sounds of movement inside were faint, but she could hear the low murmurs of conversation, Hawthorne and his men, no doubt. Lila took a deep breath, centering herself. She wasn't just here to kill a man. She was here to finish what had started so long ago. She kicked the door open with a swift, powerful motion, the loud bang echoing across the town. Inside, Hawthorne looked up in shock. His men scrambled, reaching for their weapons, but Lila was faster. She fired once, twice, hitting the 2 closest men in the chest. They crumpled to the floor with barely a sound, their lives snuffed out in an instant. Hawthorne's eyes flicked to her, his face darkening as he stood, drawing his own revolver. You think you've won, Monroe? He spat, his voice thick with rage. You're just a nuisance. You don't realize what you're up against. I don't need to, Lila said coldly, her gun trained on him. You've been a problem for far too long, Hawthorne. And now you're done. He sneered, his finger tightening on the trigger. We'll see about that. The air between them crackled with tension as Hawthorne fired first. Lila ducked, rolling to the side as his bullet slammed into the wall behind her. She fired back, her shot striking him in the arm, forcing him to drop his weapon. He stumbled back, cursing, his face contorted in pain. You think this ends with me? He snarled. There's always someone worse. Always someone willing to take my place. Lila stepped forward, her revolver aimed at his heart. Not this time, Hawthorne. With a final, controlled movement, she pulled the trigger. Hawthorne crumpled to the floor, his last breath escaping with a low rasp. Lila stood over him, her chest rising and falling as she took in the gravity of what she had just done. The Black Vultures were no more. The rival gang that had threatened Red Bluff and the surrounding land was finally gone. She had done it. She had finished it. But the war was always changing. And Lila Monroe, for all her success, knew one thing to be true: there would always be another fight. But tonight, the storm had passed. The Black Vultures had fallen, and she had brought them down. And for the first time in a long while, Lila allowed herself a breath of relief. The quiet that followed Hawthorne's death was a strange, oppressive kind of silence. Lila stood over his body, her revolver still in hand, the weight of the gun steady in her palm. The air felt still, as though the world had paused for a moment to acknowledge what she had done. The Black Vultures were no more, their empire fractured, and the leader who had been the final threat was gone. Lila exhaled slowly, her mind clearing from the fog of adrenaline. The battle was over, but it wasn't just the end of Hawthorne. It was the end of a chapter of violence, terror, and bloodshed that had defined so much of her life. She'd promised herself that this would be her last war, but she wasn't fool enough to think that it would be the last battle she'd face. The world she'd been a part of, one of bounty hunting, violence, and lawlessness, was never truly finished. But tonight, she had taken down one of its most dangerous players. She holstered her revolver and wiped her brow with the back of her hand. The room around her felt claustrophobic, a reminder of the brutality that had unfolded here just moments ago. She turned on her heel and walked out of the building, leaving the sound of her boots echoing in the now empty streets. Outside, the night had already begun to settle in, the stars above a sharp contrast to the burning fire that marked the end of Hawthorne's reign. It was over, and for the first time in a long while, Lila felt the weight of that truth. But there was one more thing to do before she could let herself rest. She mounted Willow once more, feeling the familiar sway of the mare beneath her. With each stride, the town of Hawthorne's gang disappeared behind her, and she knew where she was headed next. It was a journey she had put off for too long, a place she had hoped to avoid, but one that she knew she couldn't escape. Red Bluff. The ride back to Red Bluff was long, the roads winding, and the night air cool against her face. The events of the past few weeks had taken their toll. Her body was tired, her muscles sore, but there was something else tugging at her, a need for closure, for a final confrontation that had been left unresolved for too long. As she approached the town, the familiar sight of the Silver Spur Saloon appeared in the distance. It was the same, unchanged, and yet so different. So much had happened since she'd last walked through its doors. The town had been a place to disappear, a place to leave the past behind. But she knew she couldn't leave it there. She had made promises to herself, and promises to the people she had protected along the way. When she reached the edge of town, she dismounted Willow and walked toward the saloon, the familiar creak of the swinging doors welcoming her back. Inside, the atmosphere was quieter than she remembered. The regulars were still there, nursing drinks and murmuring amongst themselves, but something had shifted. There was a sense of peace in the air, something that hadn't been there before. Jasper was behind the bar as usual, but when he saw her enter, he stopped what he was doing, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of relief and curiosity. "You did it, didn't you?" he asked, his voice thick with unspoken words. Lila nodded, her lips tight. "It's over. The black vultures are gone. And Hawthorne, he's not a problem anymore." Jasper took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. "I figured you'd be back. And I knew that you'd finish it, sooner or later. You're the kind of person who doesn't walk away from a fight." Lila's eyes softened, a fleeting hint of gratitude in her gaze. "You're right. But I had help." Jasper glanced toward the back of the saloon, his expression thoughtful. "Sam, I assume?" Lila nodded again. "He kept me grounded. I couldn't have done it alone." There was a quiet pause between them, an unspoken understanding settling in the air. Lila's hands rested on the bar, her fingers curling around the edge as though grounding herself in the familiarity of the place. It felt different now, though. The weight of everything she had done, the people she had lost, and the person she had become had changed this place for her. After a long silence, Jasper spoke again. "What now, Lila? You going to leave this town behind?" Lila stood tall, her eyes clear and resolute. "I don't know yet. Maybe I'll stay here for a while. Red Bluff's been good to me, despite everything. But I won't be hiding anymore. The past is done. It's time to see what comes next." Jasper nodded, his hand reaching for a bottle of whiskey. "Well, whatever comes next, you're not alone this time." Lila gave him a small, appreciative smile as he poured 2 glasses of whiskey. She took one, raising it in silent toast to the road ahead, whatever it might hold. As she sipped, the familiar taste of the whiskey washed over her, and for the first time in years, she felt the quiet satisfaction of having taken control of her own fate. The war was over. The black vultures had fallen, and with their fall, the nightmare that had gripped her for so long was finally behind her. Lila Monroe wasn't running anymore. And for the first time, she allowed herself to relax, to let the weight of the past fall away. The future was uncertain, but whatever it brought, she would face it head-on. because Lila Monroe was done fighting someone else's war. She was ready to start her own. The days after Hawthorne's death felt strangely quiet to Lila, the kind of silence that settles in after a storm has passed, leaving the air still and heavy. Red Bluff had started to return to a semblance of peace, but for Lila, that peace was laced with something else, an awareness of the life she had just left behind, and the uncertainty of what would come next. The Silver Spur Saloon had become a refuge for her, a place where she could sit in the quiet company of others and let the weight of the past week slip away. Jasper had welcomed her with open arms, and the patrons, those who had seen the black vulture's grip on the town, offered her nods of acknowledgement and gratitude. Red Bluff had always been a town that lived in the shadow of lawlessness, and now that shadow had been lifted. Still, the question lingered, what next? For days, Lila had walked through the motions, eating, sleeping, writing. But there was an emptiness there, an ache she hadn't quite expected. She had rid the world of one empire of terror, but she couldn't quite rid herself of the weight of all the violence, all the lives taken, all the blood spilled. She had spent years building a reputation as a bounty hunter, hunting down outlaws who had killed and terrorized others, always moving from one job to the next, driven by the need to erase the darkness in her past. But after taking down Hawthorne and the Black Vultures, she realized something had shifted. For the first time in her life, she wasn't running from something. She wasn't trying to outpace her past. She was standing still. And that stillness was both comforting and unnerving. That morning, as the sun rose over Red Bluff and painted the sky with hues of orange and pink, Lila found herself sitting outside the Silver Spur, her back against the cool wood of the saloon's porch. Willow grazed nearby, her coat gleaming in the soft light, but Lila's thoughts were far from her horse. She was thinking about the future, and about what came after being a part of something that had consumed her for so long. The crunch of footsteps on the dirt road drew her attention, and she looked up to see Sam walking toward her. His boots kicked up dust as he approached, his face framed by the light of the rising sun. His eyes, always sharp and calculating, were softened today with a certain quiet understanding. "You've been up since before dawn," he said, his voice a low drawl. Lila nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon. "Too much time to think." "Is that a problem?" Sam asked, sitting down next to her on the porch steps. His face was weathered, but there was a certain calm about him, an ease that came from years of living in this part of the world. Lila let out a slow breath, her fingers tracing the edge of her glass. "Maybe. I don't know." Sam watched her for a moment, his gaze steady. "You thinking about leaving?" Lila shook her head, though the uncertainty in her heart was obvious even to herself. "Not exactly. But it feels strange, you know? I've been running for so long. Now that it's over, I don't know what to do with myself." Sam nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's the hardest part. You spend so much time fighting, so much time moving forward, that when you finally win, you don't know how to stop." "I don't know how to stop," Lila repeated, her voice barely a whisper. The words seemed to settle around her, heavy with the weight of all she had lost in her pursuit of vengeance. There was a long pause before Sam spoke again, his voice softer now. "You don't have to stop, Lila. Not unless you want to. Maybe you don't need to keep running or fighting, but there's a place for you here. This town doesn't have to be just a place to hide. It can be a place to build something. If you want that." Lila looked up at him then, her eyes meeting his, and she saw something there, something like hope, or maybe just the possibility of it. The idea that she could build something here, something lasting, wasn't something she had considered. She had always seen herself as a force of nature, something transient, a storm that would pass through and leave destruction in its wake. But Sam's words planted a seed in her, a thought that hadn't occurred to her until now. She wasn't sure yet what it would look like, but she didn't feel the same urgency to leave. Not anymore. "I never thought about it that way," she said quietly. Sam gave her a small, knowing smile. "I figured you hadn't. But maybe it's time to stop running. Not because you have to, but because you can." The words hung in the air, and for the first time in a long while, Lila didn't feel the familiar pull of the past, urging her to keep moving. There was something powerful in the idea of staying, of building something that wasn't built on violence, revenge, or survival. "What do you want, Lila?" Sam asked, his voice quiet but insistent. "What kind of life do you want now?" Lila paused, the question hitting her in a way she wasn't ready for. She had spent so many years living in the shadow of her past, driven by a sense of duty and retribution. But now, with the black vultures gone, the world was quiet again, and she could feel the stirrings of something else deep within her. Something that had always been there but had been buried beneath the weight of her choices. For the first time, Lila allowed herself to imagine a life that wasn't driven by bloodshed. "I don't know yet," she said softly, her eyes distant. "But maybe I'll figure it out." Sam didn't press her. Instead, he stood and stretched, dusting off his clothes. "You will. And you've got time." Lila stood too, her body feeling lighter than it had in weeks. She had fought for so long, so fiercely, but now the battle was over. The world had slowed, and with it, the possibility of something different. It was frightening, but also exhilarating. For the first time in a long while, Lila felt something other than the weight of the past. She felt the glimmer of a future ahead of her, one that didn't require running or hiding. She didn't know exactly what it would look like, but for once, she wasn't afraid to find out. And as she stood there, side by side with Sam, the promise of something new lingered in the air between them. Red Bluff wasn't just a town to hide in anymore. It was home. And Lila Monroe was ready to build her life there, brick by brick. The morning sunlight filtered through the windows of the Silver Spur, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. The saloon had become a quiet haven in the days that followed Hawthorne's death, the tension that had once hung thick in the air now replaced by a new, uncertain peace. Red Bluff was still reeling from the violence that had come before, but it was no longer a town in fear. It was healing. Lila stood behind the bar, wiping down the counter with a rag. The familiar motions felt soothing, almost comforting. She hadn't planned on staying in Red Bluff, but now, as she worked through the quiet hours of the morning, she realized that it felt right. There was something about the way the town had rallied, how the people here had fought to survive, that made her think maybe, just maybe, this could be her place. She didn't need to run anymore, didn't need to chase down the ghosts of her past. She could build something here. Something lasting. Jasper had been quieter these past few days, as though he understood the weight of Lila's decision, but he didn't ask questions. He simply let her work beside him, no words needed. In the evenings, when the townspeople gathered for their evening drinks, Lila felt the weight of their gazes, some of gratitude, others of curiosity, but all of them unspoken, waiting for her to decide her future. She had already made the decision, in her heart, but she hadn't said the words out loud yet. "Another drink, Lila?" a voice broke through her thoughts. Lila turned to find Sam standing at the edge of the bar, a thoughtful expression on his face. He had been a quiet presence in the days following their victory, but she knew he was waiting, just as she was, for the next step. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was still early, but the saloon was already filling with patrons. "I'm good for now," she replied with a smile, wiping her hands on her apron. Sam raised an eyebrow. "Got a minute?" Lila nodded and set the rag down. "I've got a minute." She followed him to the small table near the back of the saloon, away from the bustling crowd. The morning light filtered in through the dusty windows, casting long beams across the table. Sam settled into a chair and leaned back, his gaze fixed on the door for a moment before meeting Lila's eyes. "You've been quiet lately," Sam said, his voice low. "More than usual." Lila sat down across from him, her fingers tracing the edge of her cup. "I've been thinking," she said quietly. Sam's gaze softened. "About what?" "About this place. About what comes next." She leaned forward, her voice steady, but filled with something she hadn't fully expressed yet. "I've spent my life running. Running from people, from myself. But I'm not running anymore, Sam." I don't need to. A small smile tugged at Sam's lips, his eyes glinting with something approving. I figured as much. Lila's gaze shifted to the window, where the town of Red Bluff sprawled beyond the glass. It wasn't a place of grand promises, but it was home, and for the first time, it felt like she could find something real here. A future. Have you thought about what you're going to do here? Sam asked, his tone careful. You can't just fade into the background. Not with what you've done for this town. Lila took a slow breath, her fingers still tracing the edge of the cup. I don't know yet, she admitted. But maybe that's okay. Maybe it's enough to just be here for now, and figure it out as I go. Sam didn't press her. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. I think you'll figure it out. This town needs someone like you. Someone who's seen the worst and still believes in the best. Lila smiled faintly. I don't know about that. You don't have to know. You just have to be here. Lila took a deep breath, the weight of everything she had accomplished, the battles she'd fought and the choices she'd made, finally settling into a place of quiet understanding. She had always believed that peace wasn't something she could hold on to. But now, with the chaos of the past behind her, she realized she didn't need to chase it. It was here, in moments like this, in the steady rhythm of life moving forward. She reached out and placed her hand on the table, palm open. Sam looked at her for a moment before placing his hand over hers, solid and reassuring. It was a small gesture, but for Lila, it spoke volumes. She wasn't alone anymore. The doors to the saloon opened with a creak, and a few more patrons filed in, the familiar faces of Red Bluff's residents. Lila didn't look up immediately, but she could hear the shuffle of boots on the wooden floor, the sound of a conversation starting up at the bar, and the hum of the town slowly coming back to life. But this time it didn't feel like a fight. This time it felt like a beginning. What do you say, Lila? Sam's voice cut through her thoughts. You ready to start something new? Lila looked up at him, her smile small but genuine. Yeah, she said, her voice steady. I think I am. And for the first time in a long while, Lila Monroe allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the quiet life she had fought for was finally within reach. The road ahead was uncertain, but it didn't matter. The past had shaped her, but it didn't have to define her anymore. And for the first time, Lila Monroe was ready to embrace whatever came next. Because she was home. And this time, she wasn't going anywhere. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.